Let us return to Visual Studio this time and perform some server-side changes in the application. So we're now going to create the server-side entity, and we're also going to add a migration. So of course, we're back in Visual Studio to make these changes. First, I'm going to add my entity, and those are going to live in the core project. Under the core project, I'm going to create a new folder. And it may not surprise you that I'm going to call that folder Phonebook. In there, I'm going to create my entity called person. I'm going to add a new class, name it person, and I'm going to bring in some code. And I paste in this snippet. Visual Studio is complaining about a couple of missing using statements. So let's fix that first. There we go, it is happy again. Now the first thing you notice is that my person class is inheriting from the full audited entity base class. Let's take a look at this base class. As you can see here, I'm inheriting from full audited entity in int, because my person class is going to have an integer key. And this base class brings in support for some auditing properties for creation, modification, and deletion. And what you see here is also that we have an isDeleted property. When I will later on delete a person, it will not really get deleted. Instead, this boolean will get set to false. Next, you also see that the name and surname are required, and all of these properties also use the max length property, pointing to a constant that I have defined at the top. Now let's go to our database context, where I'll add a DB set for this person class. I hope you remember we now need to go to the Entity Framework core project, and in there we'll find our DB context, the Phonebook demo DB context. In here we'll add our DB set for person, and let's bring in a reference to the person class. I should now do a build, and then we can add the migration. Everything has built successfully, that's good. So now we can go to the Package Manager console and add our migration. So here in the Package Manager console, I'll type add migration. I'll specify the name. What have I done here? I've added the person table. So I'll give the migration a name, added persons table. Make sure that you set the default project to the Entity Framework core project, since that is the one that contains the DB context. Let's hit enter now and let's create the migration. Let's take a look at the migration first. Here's the migration. In the migration, we can see that a table called PBPersons is going to be created. Now, where's that name coming from? Well, take a look here. We have added the table attribute to the person class. And in there, we specified the name of the table we wanted to create. Here we then see the table's structure that is going to be created. We can now run the update database statement. Now the update database has succeeded. Let's take a look at our database. So I'm going to go here because I'm using LocalDB to the SQL Server Object Explorer, and in there I'll find my database. It is the Phonebook demo database. In there I'll find a new table, PBPersons. At this point, there won't be any data in that table just yet. Of course, we have just created the table. So how can we now create the table so we can later on see a couple of default persons added to my database? Well, I'm going to do some seeding. Now, when I say seeding, I'm basically specifying that I'm going to create a class that is going to feed initial data into my database. Now, where are we supposed to put that class? Well, let me show you. Under migrations seed, we find a host folder. In there are already some seed classes. I'm going to add my own class here, the initial people creator, because that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create new person instances. So I say add new class, and let's call this class initial people creator. Let's make this class public. And let's paste in some code here. So what is this class going to do? Well, it is going to use the Phonebook demo DB context. I need to bring that in, by the way. There we go. It is going to be injected using dependency injection, and then I'm going to create a couple of person instances on my persons DB set on my context. You of course also need to bring in support for link. There we go. And finally, I also need to bring in support for the person class. Now I have a couple of hard-coded persons that are going to be inserted into my database. I seem to have made a mistake here by pasting in one curly brace too many. Let's delete that. Of course, just creating this class won't do any magic. We still need to call this class from somewhere. So we can call the initial host DB builder. In there, I'm going to now specify that I want a new initial people creator passing in the context and also calling its create method. So we specify here new initial people creator. We pass in the context, that's the DB context, and then we call create. Notice that this class is going to be responsible for saving the changes that we've made to the DB context. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the application and then we'll see if this code actually got executed, so it seeded this initial data into our database. Let's do that now. So I've now loaded up the application. Let's take a look at SQL Server Object Explorer again and open the persons table again. View data, we don't see anything, but let's refresh. There we go. Our person instances are now in the database. You can see those names here at the very end. That seems to have worked. Let's go back to the slides for now. Edit input. And for the sake of simplicity, I'll put those in this file as well. There we go. At this point, the app service is also happy. All the required types are now found. Let's go back to the custom DTO mapper and add these custom mappings. Now, in fact, I should say to you at this point, we don't really need those because they would actually work out of the box. But just for the sake of completeness, let's add these mappings as well. Let's run at this point the API again. And because we made changes in the server side, let's go back to nswag and let it run again. Now, to allow support for editing a person, I'm going to add another HTML file here. I've called it the edit person modal component. As the name implies, this will be another modal pop-up that allows me to edit the person properties. This is a pretty simple piece of HTML that is just going to visualize the person name, surname, and email address. You of course need to call this from the phone book component. I'm going to add another button here. There we go. That allows me to edit the person, so the phone numbers, and also edit the person via the modal window. And just like we did with the create person modal, I'm going to also bring in my edit person modal dialog here. Of course, at this point, this will not be found, so we need to bring in another component for that modal dialog. That's going to be the edit person modal component. This has a selector edit person modal so that Angular knows that this edit person modal should be handled via this component here. The code for this is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to spend any time on it. You of course need to now also let Angular know about this modal component. So we need to go back to the main module. And we earlier added support for the phone book component as well as the create person modal component. And now we need to bring in the edit person modal component. And add another import here as well. With this in place, we should now be able to run the application again and edit persons as well. And now I can click here on edit person. And now the dialog is effectively showing, allowing me to edit my person. With this in place, we now have a fully working application. How cool is that? So far, we haven't looked at the multi-tenancy in the application. While this is a core feature that's built into ASP.NET 0, what this basically means is that your application can be used for multiple tenants, so basically customers. ASP.NET 0 brings in data isolation, so that entities belonging to tenant A aren't visible to tenant B. Enabling this is pretty simple, since it's, like I said, built into the framework. To bring in support on the entity level, so in our case, person, the type needs to implement the IMustHaveTenant interface. Based on this, ASP.NET 0 will then itself filter the entities belonging to the current tenant. In the final demo of this module, we are going to bring in support for multi-tenancy. In this final demo, I'm going to show you how you can enable multi-tenancy in the application. multi-tenancy is built into ASP.NET 0, so it's pretty simple to start using that. And basically what it will do, it will make sure that entities that belong to one tenant are isolated from other tenants. As mentioned, it's built in, so it's pretty simple to get this to work. Now we have in the very beginning disabled multi-tenancy. I hope you remember. In the phonebook demo consts class, we have set multi-tenancy disabled to false. Well, to enable it again, it's pretty simple. You enable it by setting this value to true. Now just doing that is not enough. You also need to go back to your entity, that is the person class. And instead of having this just be a full audited entity, we also need to implement an interface called the IMustHaveTenant interface. This interface has just a tenant ID property. So we're going to have to implement that property here as well. There we go. If you also directly would work with phones, we also need to implement it there. Now in this case, we only access phones via the person class, so it's not really necessary. But keep in mind that all entities that you directly use from your application should in fact now implement this interface and therefore have this tenant ID added. Now to enable this on the database level, we also need to do another migration. So we go back to the Package Manager console and add a new migration. Now in this migration, it only added basically this tenant ID column. Built into ASP.NET 0, it now knows that this entity belongs to a certain tenant. Finally, we call update database, and this will apply that migration. Let's run the server-side application again and then see what has changed now that I have enabled multi-tenancy. Make sure, by the way, before you try this, that you log out, because otherwise you will not see the change. So I can now log in with my username and password again. I log in. And now you see here a new entry, tenants. By default, there's only one tenant available, and we can create a new tenant here. So now you can see that we have two tenants, the default, and then we have the test tenant. I can now actually jump to that tenant. I can log in as this tenant to basically see what a user of this tenant will see. I can select my admin user that I just created. And now we see our phonebook application again, but now we don't see any people, which is perfect because my users that we created earlier are not part of this tenant. We have effectively isolated the data from one tenant to the next. All right, we've made it. We have a working application. Now it's time to sit back, enjoy the feeling of success, and maybe have a good cup of coffee. Congratulations! We have one module left where I will close this tutorial and give you some pointers on where to go next.